And good afternoon. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Welcome to the live stream of our conversation with Senator Kel Seliger, and welcome to our studio audience as well. Senator Seliger represents the 31st Texas Senate District, which stretches from the Panhandle south to the Permian Basin. He's the chair of the Higher Education Committee in the Texas Senate, and also serves on the Finance and Education Committees, among other words. In short, he's going to be in the middle of things when the 85th Legislature is gavelled into session in January. Senator Seliger was elected to the Texas Senate in March of 2004 and has been re-elected to that seat 4 times since then. Before that, he served 4 terms as the mayor of Amarillo. He attended Dartmouth College, but he's both married to and the father of die-hard Texas Longhorns, and we're very happy to have him back again as a guest in the Texas Politics Speaker Series. Welcome, Senator, and thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thanks again for having me.
It's a pleasure. So, this is going to be what, your 6th session?
I first came in the special session of the 79th, so yes, 6th one.
So, are you ready to come to town? Does it feel any different to you this time?
No. It feels the same. With seniority and additional responsibilities like chairmanship, it becomes a little different. But other than that, it's the same. We've got a lot of interesting legislation to work on, and I always look forward to working with my staff. As everyone else who sits in this chair tells you, I have the best one in the Capitol. In this case, am telling the truth, though. And so, yeah, I always look forward to it. It's very, very interesting. The process is just fascinating all the time.
Well, with the presidential election more or less out of the way, and I'll probably come back to that, but it is a time in the state for agendas. So I want to ask you later maybe about the agendas of others, but let's start with yours.
Okay.
So what do you think the legislature should be focused on, and what are you going to be focusing your efforts on?
We have to focus first and foremost on the budget. That's got to be passed even if nothing else is. And this is going to be a tough buy-in, and what everybody is being told. The statistic I read lately is that direct revenues to the state of Texas from oil and gas operations should be down as much as 30%, sales tax down by 3%. And it's a very pervasive tax, so 3% is a lot. We're going to have to deal with that. With a state that's growing by about 400,000 people a year, enrollment in public schools grows by 70 or 80,000 kids. That alone, because it's funded by formula, if you take inflation and enrollment growth, that's going to drive more money in a session where we don't have more money, whatever that is. We know that we're going to have a supplemental budget to deal with on bills that have come due in excess of estimations before, about $1.3 billion. We're under a court order for our foster care system. And paying forward or paying back on Medicaid is going to be several hundreds of millions of dollars before we show up.
When you lay all that out, it's kind of a wonder that you're glad to be back.
Governments ought to be struggling for money. We ought to be short of money, because if we have all the money that we need, people of Texas don't, because that's where we get the money. And so we ought to have a tough time budgeting. It's very challenging and it can be frustrating. But our budget system imposes a certain discipline that I think is very productive, from having to stay with the controller's biennial revenue estimate, and the fact that we have to have a balanced budget, that we have spending limits to which we must accrue. And so it's a good system for the people of the state of Texas, but it's a challenging one.
I think it's kind of an article of faith in the Capitol that sessions when there's less money is, for the legislators, in some ways is a little easier than sessions when there's quote unquote extra money. Does that make sense to you? Is it easy when it's easier to say no? Is it a little easier to sort out priorities?
And it's absolutely true. It doesn't make it easier to say no, but when there is money, if there is an operating surplus or something like that, we have to pick to whom we tell yes and no, and to what extent. In an economy like this one, we're pretty much telling everyone no, and so yeah, that is easier.
Let's get a little more specific. So we're sitting here at the University of Texas at Austin. One of the issues that we've already seen bills filed on, you've been involved in the past, who sets tuition, the issue of so-called tuition deregulation. How does that look to you? We know there are bills now asking to re-regulate tuition, to put the legislature back, if you will, in the driver's seat on setting tuition. But you have sort of a different approach to that, it seems to me. So where are you on all that as we go into this?
First of all, we have to keep in mind that when the legislature did regulation in tuition from 93 to 2003, tuition went up more than it was deregulated from 2003 to 2013. So there's no automatic control there. We're seeing proposals to freeze tuition. Well, freeze it how much and where? And we have to be very, very careful as we regulate it, because the demands of the people who live in the state of Texas and the students are pretty high ones. They demand excellence. And so we're trying to weigh all those things. What I did in the last session, and we'll do again, is a bill that allows institutions to do pretty much whatever they want to do as regards inflation. But if they want to increase above that, have a performance-based system that says in terms of maybe first to second year retention, or time to complete 30 hours or 60 hours, how that treats and advances at-risk students and things like that, and have points there that will justify increases in tuition. They will be modest increases. It will require a number of those measures to be met. And we're trying to, and here's the tough part. One, you want them rigorous. But two, you can't, not a one size fits all. So if you take first to second year retention at the University of Texas, it's only slightly behind Harvard. There's no trick there. And so what do you use where it makes it just as rigorous for University of Texas as it does for Sol Ross? Texas is about 20th in the nation in terms of the cost of university tuition. Not a bad spot to be. But one of the things that people also don't realize is there's a huge variety in the price points available by where you go. And I think I've told you this story. I've told a lot of people this story, that I was at a meeting at Houston Community College. A very nice lady stood up, said, my son goes to Texas A&M. Perished the thought, you say to that, but nonetheless he did. And he goes to Texas A&M, can you reduce his tuition? To which I said, absolutely, ma'am. And she says, you can? I said, yeah, but not before tomorrow morning. And I said, what we'll do is, if he's doing well at A&M, and she insisted that he was, that we can get him enrolled at University of Texas Permian Basin, or West Texas A&M University in the district that I represent. He'll get a really good education for a fraction of what you're going to pay. How about it? To the best of my knowledge, he graduated from Texas A&M and is doing very well. But there's a choice there. That's the public's choice.
Do you think the terrain has changed enough since last session? Because I know that bill had some tough going last time. Nothing gets passed on the first go, right. Hardly ever. Right. I mean, do you think there's progress this time? Do you feel like you got a better shot this time?
Yes, because in the meantime, what they've seen is the University of Texas system has approved 3% tuition increases, I think, to all its institutions. And so people in the legislature are going, wait, we didn't want tuition increases. In this case, we don't think there need to be tuition increases because the University of Texas system has all the money in the world. Well, if you're going to regulate it after a fashion. But let's say that it was complete regulation, and then what happens is if you're a state representative in, take your pick, Plano, then your decision about tuition is made on political grounds. Jim, I'll vote for you again if you'll increase tuition to my favorite institution. Well, then we've got no sort of empirical measure or something like that. Now we're doing tuition increases based on whim. We can do better than that. So as we move forward, pop back out to a more general question. One of the things that looms over this, I think, is, are we putting enough as a state into higher education? What do you think about that? Depends on who you ask. There is no agency in government that says we're putting an adequate amount of money into their endeavor. We have no real metric there because nobody's getting enough money. So we have to do what we can out of the funds available in the most tax-averse environment that we've probably ever seen in this state and country. And so we have to balance that too. And so we try to look at it productively and look at the ability to, and it's a completely different paradigm in higher education, to raise funds themselves and that sort of thing. And so I have always been a proponent of addressing enrollment growth, inflation, and we'll sort of see where that goes. That means money into formula. One of the things I think is also absolutely essential are the Texas grants, and that's the big state system, almost $750 million that go to students. It's our biggest scholarship program. It's tremendously important. That's how we in the legislature control tuition, by formula funding and those scholarships. And I think they're very, very important. If there's any money that becomes fungible at the end of the session, I would like to see it there right after we address public education.
I want to get to public education in a second. I want to ask you a couple more things about higher ed, but I do have public ed questions. Speaking of financial aid, where are you on the tuition set-aside money? That seems like that is going to come up. The Lieutenant Governor has talked about it a bit. You've talked about it in the past in terms of the tuition redirects.
Right. Tuition redirects, to me, in a lot of ways, are simply an accounting device. And so you can either direct by law part of my tuition to your scholarship by law, or you simply do it because that's part of the monies that you have available. And it's really an accounting sort of thing. People kind of misunderstood, I think, what the Lieutenant Governor was talking about. He wasn't talking about removing the money from set-asides from higher education. He was talking about trying to find the public funding to put it back in there, probably in Texas grants and scholarships for the same thing that we say that we're using the set-asides for.
But given the sensitivities and the climate in the state that you referenced a few minutes ago, you could understand why people might have been a little skeptical. That the money would, that once you take the money away, that it would be redirected, that it would be accounting, that it wouldn't disappear.
You're not saying there's precedent for that? Yeah, people ought to be skeptical. People ought to be skeptical about almost everything that goes on there, particularly as regards money, because there's so many different constituencies and things like that. I've got no problem with that skepticism.
Another budgetary question that also touches on some real sensitive issues, Hazelwood. The Hazelwood funding, that bill, there was talk about the conflicting or the tension between the commitments to veterans and their families and what some would say was the unforeseen fiscal burden that's creating. Do you think the legislature is going to move on that again this time?
We're going to have to. We've got to, in some form or fashion. It's costing this institution $9 million a year. It's the largest unfunded mandate that we have. Hazelwood has always been a great program, and it addresses the educational needs of our veterans, but after 2009, we added the children of them, the legacy. We were told at the time that would be maybe 8,800 individuals. It's 22,000. It is $124 million expense. And it's a lot more at places like Texas State.
Sure.
And places like that. It's a huge unfunded mandate, and we're going to have to address it in some form or fashion. That bill was carried by Senator Birdwell, who is a much decorated retired lieutenant colonel and who has the best interests of veterans at the forefront of his thoughts all the time. And he just got abused over it for not appreciating veterans. But now we've seen, and it's, Hazelwood's going to stay in place for veterans, no matter what else happens. But now what has happened is we've seen a lot of people go in and designate a grandparent as a guardian of a grandchild, and thereby have the benefits accrue to the grandchildren of veterans. And it was never intended to be that. We've got to iron out the system. We've either got to come up with a bunch of money or come up with some other mechanism, because it's really expensive.
So probably some combination of tightening and funding, most likely.
Yeah, and the concepts that I've thought about was, what if it was a percentage of designated tuition or statutory tuition, or a percentage of the overall direct Hazelwood grants and things like that at the discretion of the institution, and so that it's not so much of an unfunded mandate.
But it's tough, right? I mean, you mentioned the abuse of Senator Birdwell. Got a very unlikely person to be criticized for not supporting veterans. It's
unlikely and truly undeserving of that sort of abuse, because this was done trying to do what we could for veterans. And there was no motivation other than largesse, which is unusual for governmental budgeting. And it was unfortunate. He did a good job with the bill.
Okay, so you mentioned public ed. Let's turn to that. So what are your priorities in this area?
Well, first of all, it's got to be public ed finance. We have, between the growth in the mineral wealth in the recapture system and the way that we have capped the taxing abilities, we are butting our heads up against the very capability of school districts to do what they need to do and what they can afford to do. And so we're forcing these tax elections, which is not a bad idea, letting taxpayers in a local area vote on their tax increases. But so I come to you and say, we want to increase your taxes by so much, and it's really going to help our schools, and people are proud of their schools around the state of Texas. Your immediate inclination is to say, sure, for my kids. So now I tell you 75% of the money that you were going to raise from your taxes is going to go to Manor school districts. Your response then probably should be a good deal less enthusiastic. And so we're providing substantial disincentive for people to invest in their schools. We're going to need to address that, I think, in Recapture. That will be an expensive proposition.
That makes it sound kind of easy, but it's not, right? There are, my sense is I did a couple of panels at the Texas Tribune Festival, one with a handful of senators, one with a handful of House members, Democrats and Republicans on both. There seemed to be, not a lot of agreement on the how, and frankly, on the Senate panel, not quite as much interest in tackling public finances on the House committee, on school finances on the House committee. Is there the oxygen in the Senate, in the legislature overall, let's say, to tackle both public finance or school finance and to meet the school choice mandate that seems to be very important to the lieutenant governor?
It's our job. Is there the oxygen to do it? No, a lot of people would like to go do something else. When you get into the formulas by which we distribute money, it's very complex, antiquated in some ways, but it's what we've got, and there's not going to be a perfect way. We can juggle this and juggle that. But how do you fund school districts when you have them? One school district I represent is Channing, 276 students, and Houston Independent School District, which is 225,000 students, and yet we want public education to do the same thing in the lives of those kids. At the end of the day, the way we will most directly deal with things like Recapture is cold, hard cash. That's a different issue altogether from just the policy involved. Then again, this is a session, one of the first times since 1984, we're not operating under a court mandate. We're not doing anything because the court ordered it. We're doing it because it was our job anyway. Quite frankly, court decision didn't mean much to a lot of us. It's still our job. Even then, the court didn't tell us what we had to do, just that our system was inadequate. And anyway, that was the assertion going forward. And so is there will to do that? I think we might make some progress in certain areas. Are we going to tend to everything? The whole $3.5 billion that are currently subject to recapture? No.
Do you think the lieutenant governor's emphasis on school choice, let me ask this a different way.
Okay.
Where are you on school choice? Are you interested in experimenting? Are you all in? How do you look at that? And allowing for the fact that school choice is a term of art rather than a specific policy.
I was going to say it's an artless term because what we're talking about is vouchers. It's okay. It's not one of the words.
We're all grown-ups here?
It's not one of the words you were barred from saying at the dinner table. Go ahead.
Well, it depends where you're eating dinner, I think. But
the problem with public education in Texas is not that we don't have public money going to private schools. At the same time, people deserve options. They are taxpayers. And clearly, we don't want young people stuck in non-performing schools. We have, I think, 1 or 2 school districts in the state of Texas that have been in the improvement required category for 7 years. That should never be allowed to happen, ever. That is sentencing somebody to a deficient situation, and we have to do something. What we do, I just want to see the legislation and see what it looks like and see what it does. My immediate inclination is to look at the foundation school program. If we take 2/3 of a student's average daily attendance payment, what is the effect? What is the benefit to the school district by removing that student? At the same time, it's the standards that we have in private education, where we have the same accountability standards that we do for public schools who are getting state money. And so, yeah, it has been announced as a priority. We ought to treat it that way. But I think we ought to see what the legislation looks like when it comes out.
Talking about accountability standards brings us to the linkage between these two topics. That is, you've been pretty active in talking about thinking carefully and creatively about what happens in K through 12 public education and higher ed in terms of both workforce development and college prep. How do you feel like that conversation is going? You and I were at a conference recently where there were lots of people in the room that seemed to think it wasn't going very well.
It's going slowly because we have always viewed education as silos. There's that silo K through 12 and that silo that's what, 13 through 16 or whatever. We've added pre-K to the first silo. Education is a continuum over someone's life. Everybody in kindergarten today is a college student. We just need to give them a little time. And so we have to think about it in those terms. And we have to make sure that when they get to the top of this part of the continuum, the 12th grade, they're ready for 13. And there are all kinds of issues, be it articulation and credits, transferability, and things like all kinds of issues that we deal with a little bit at a time. Over the last several years, we've made a lot of progress, but it takes a while.
You were active in sort of thinking about, along with a lot of other people in the legislature, the role of testing in public education, what that tells us, what kind of information it gives us in that pipeline. Where do you think we are in that conversation?
I think we're making progress. If my legislation I have planned passes this session, we will have made a lot more progress. Thank you very much for that opportunity. We need to be careful with testing because it can tell us a lot of things. And if you're going to assess both comparatively and intrinsically the rigor of public schools, you need some sort of standard. 1,041 school districts. We need to make sure that in Orange and in Stratford, that the kids are getting the same thing, that they're being tested at the same rigor of the same curriculum. Therein lies the value of the standardized test. Then we talk about the standardized test. I wrote the original bill that did away with the tax test. I wrote the original bill that reduced the STAR test to 5 tests from 15. And I'm going to have a testing bill or bills this time that are going to look at the various alternatives. When we ask the question about college preparation, a lot of people think that's what the STAR test is for, and that's not necessarily what it's for, only to the degree that the curriculum prepares one. But here's the thing about the STAR test. It is of absolutely no value or importance to people in higher education at all. Right. And so what can we do to do that? What can we look at that has value in terms of telling us what we need to know and what we need to fix in public schools, and it may even tell universities something about the students.
So do you think that the kind of existing standardized tests have a role in that, SAT, ACT?
Oh, no question. ACT is sort of the gold standard and gives us a lot of information. I recently went to the Complete College Conference, and one of the things it talks about that today as we sit here, the best indicator of college preparation is grade point average. Nothing exotic, nothing fancy, nothing expensive, grade point average. But if we're going to look at where your grade point average is in preparing you for this university, what's our standard there? And clearly, some sort of assessment is probably necessary. There are those. When we look at ACT, SAT, which is what you look at, the Texas Success Initiative, I think, has a lot of merits, and we're looking very hard at that. Most, if not all, school districts either offer it or give it today.
I want to shift gears a little bit. You were a mayor.
Yep.
You seem to have fond memories of that.
Oh, being a mayor of a really good, well-run city, one of the greatest jobs in America.
So what do you make of the current dynamic in terms of discussions of the legislature's oversight of what city and county governments are doing? I mean, I'm thinking of, not these particular things necessarily, but Senator Schwertner filed his state-level ride-sharing bill. You alluded to the discussion of property taxes and rollback rates. How do you know where to draw the line between when the legislature should get involved and when they shouldn't with what we sometimes colloquially call local control?
Well, it's not colloquial. There really is local control or lack of it. It's a question of role of government. And local control generally has defined smaller government and more responsive government. And to think that we need more control in the state by central government in Austin, is it's the same problem that we have with central government in Washington telling this government what to do. Is assertion recently by a member of the legislature that really cities and counties were just agencies of the state of Texas. And while they clearly have an interaction, when it comes to the delivery of service to the taxpayers, local government does a far better job. And so I'm concerned about it. It's interesting that when you talk about carriage for hire, taxi cabs essentially, that going back into what, I don't know, the late 1700s, cities have always governed that. What the qualifications are and what the cash flows are going to be of the city and things like that. All of a sudden, it's a state issue. Why? Because it is a matter of safety and security? No, it's a matter of money. A lot of it being spent in the Texas Capitol. And I find it interesting. There are no good actors here, make no mistake. And what's that's called? It's Uber. We've all used it and works very well. And they've just finished their latest contract in Houston, and it's in Dallas, and it's in San Antonio, and San Francisco, and Los Angeles, and not Austin. What is going on? And I think something needs to be done. At the same time, the way that Uber is going about this is just pitiful. Just pitiful to have this huge election and spend millions of dollars, lose the election, and say, since we can't negotiate it, and since we can't get at the ballot box, we'll just go money whip it at the Capitol. It deserves an early and painful death.
So your theory there, I mean, the underlying theory there is that it's become, for lack of a better term, a lobby fight, a money fight in a lot of ways.
No question.
We had Comptroller Hager here not too long ago, and I kind of asked him a similar question, and he kind of dealt with it by saying, you know, these state and local issues, they're always kind of there.
Sure.
It's always kind of there. It feels to me like it's flared up a little more, though. Am I wrong?
No, it has. It has when people find...
Thank goodness. Because he told me I was wrong.
You were just dreaming it. No, it has flared up because people in the Capitol find it, I think, frustrating to find things that they don't have power over. And I'm one of those people who wants to look at things that we can do less government. What can we do less? So why doesn't the state go in and regulate things that the plumbing code, you have to use metal conduit instead of plastic? Why not? Why does the state not go in and set statewide building codes, which cities do very effectively now? Why does the state not go in and regulate whether we use fluoride or ozone in water treatment? Those are local decisions done by people who, by the way, are elected by the same people who vote for us. Like it's a well-informed, smart vote when they're voting for the legislature, and folks don't have a clue when they're voting for county commissioners and city councilmen. That's not the case.
So, do you think that applies to this discussion that's coming out of the select committee that's kind of been going all over the state having hearings on the local rollback elections? How are you coming on that?
To an extent. And here's the people of Texas are telling us they want us to control taxes. They don't know where, what, and whom. And I sit around and talk to county judges last week, and I said, make no mistake, if we walked around this town and polled your family members and asked us if they'd like us to control taxes, the answer is yes. How do we do that? And they still have to have the tools to do the jobs that they do. If the federal government came and told us today that they were going to limit how much we could tax oil and gas, which, by the way, we should limit, we would be cataleptic about the federal government regulating that, and yet we propose to do it. We already have those caps. It's an 8% rollback. It's by petition, having automatic elections. Okay, should we have an automatic election of the public every time we address money or spend more money or have a new tax or fee? Probably not. Should it be regulated by the federal government? Definitely not. And so we need to look at tax policy that is both responsible and responsive, but includes everybody in the discussion.
You mentioned sort of the federal government a couple times. It's a good time to pivot then. What did you make of the presidential election?
I think it's like something no one has ever seen in the United States before. And I think that's always a good thing, just in case somebody thinks that there's nothing new anymore. You have a lot closer touch on that than everything else, because you look at all the empirical stuff as well as the communications and
That
things
served
like
us
that.
very well.
Well, it doesn't mean it's not worth trying. At one time, alchemy looked like it was going to produce a lot of wealth. At the same time, we've never seen anything like this. But I was watching Karl Rove on Fox News on election night. And what is underlying what we saw is this deep sense of populism that is not only happening in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, but overseas in the European Union. And it speaks so loudly, so deep is the frustration with people that they set aside all standards for election. And so it's an interesting thing. And it's going to be very interesting. It ought to be troubling in a way, because I'm optimistic. I'm a Republican, so I'm very optimistic. Is the new standard for election going to be one who best expresses antipathy toward the federal government and who has the most media-produced popularity and name recognition, having a reality TV host become president of the United States when that appears to be a good deal of the attraction? I think that it can be worse in a lot of places, because I could see Kim Kardashian being governor of California. At the same time, it is also a rare opportunity where somebody's been elected who's not in Washington and who has not done all the things that we complain about, has made campaign promises, and is going to wake up in the White House with a majority, Republican majority in the Senate, Republican majority in the House, and a clear mandate to do all of those things, and what form address the border and security and some trade agreements, executive orders, the Supreme Court selections. How many opportunities are there? And I don't know that we've seen that situation exist a lot either. So I can't wait till January 21st.
Well, you walked right up to this, so in a way I should get down to what do you make of the president-elect himself? Now, I mean, it's one thing to, I think, talk about his rise, and I think we all have, but now that he's there, what do you expect? What do you make of him?
Remember,
you've been around a lot of political people.
Possibly to my detriment, but I don't know. Shortly after he was sworn in, or his first day in office, John F. Kennedy is reported to have said, "Now what the hell do we do?" And we're going to know a lot by the people that President-elect Trump brings into the White House with him. Whatever Nixon's shortcomings were, for instance, I think he brought some great people into government. Some had already been there and things like that. I think we should have absolutely the highest expectations. The American people are deserving of those high expectations and deserve to have them met. And I think we should be very optimistic, because a lot of the things that the president-elect is talking about are going to be good for America. One of the things that he has not talked enough about, I'm afraid, is the $19 trillion debt. The largest expense items, cost centers, if you will, in the federal government are the military, entitlements, and debt. At the rate we are going, our grandchildren are going to have a tax burden probably not much different than Sweden's. It's a horrible thought.
And he's not talked much about that.
No, and that concerns me, because that's one of the biggest problems that I think we're going to have.
How do you think, if at all, both the new president and unified government under the Republican Party, and we can kind of talk about how Republican Donald Trump is and is not, but how do you think that impacts the legislature, I mean, and politics here, if at all?
It remains to be seen. My impression, our politics are what they are. We know what we need to do going forward, whether inauguration takes place or not. It can have some substantial effect, certainly in budgetary sense, when we have more hope than we've had in a long time that the federal government would step up and meet their responsibilities on the border. And most of those responsibilities are theirs. The first thing they could do is come up with the additional $200, $300 million that DPS has asked for, which they spend pretty beneficially, and they could address the other $800 million that we're spending of taxpayers' money in the state of Texas that should be money from the federal government. When you talk about downsizing, I don't know if you need to completely do away with the U.S. Department of Education, but if you cut it in half tomorrow, it'd be one of the best things that happens, because when it comes to regulation and direction, public education is very much a state and local enterprise. We've got Texas Education Agency and we have locally elected school boards. That third layer of regulation and direction is absolutely useless. They need to sort of divide our money up and set broad guidelines, dropout reduction and things like that. What a great opportunity to do some things just like that.
So in general, I mean, this oversimplifies it, but a little bit more, you would like to see a little bit more of a block grant approach, which is some of what he's talked about, right? On border security, I mean, I think there's a lot of demand for border security spending, both in the legislature and, you know, it's actually one of the areas of spending that's relatively well received, you know, in the state, particularly among Republicans based on polling. But I still think people were a little taken aback at the extra ask from DPS. Do you think this takes some of the pressure off the legislature in that realm? I mean, you spoke of it hopefully, but it seems to me it would be reasonable if somebody stood up and said, well, let's wait and see what they're doing before we approve this extra money, particularly in a time of tight budgets.
Potentially. First of all, every agency is going to ask us for more money. Every one. And we have to look at that critically. Clearly, we're enjoying some successes. We're going to put 250 more DPS officers on the border. We have a network now of sensors and motion sensors and video sensors, new generation of boats on rivers, which we unfortunately must have. It's not so much that people are consumed with the expenditure of money for border security, it's the border security itself. We are a nation of laws, and our immigration laws are part of those. There is a real national security element there when you talk about human trafficking and you talk about contraband, the threat of incursions across our border that are potentially threatening. Several years ago, when Siggy Gonzalez was a sheriff in Zapata County, and it's been about 8-9 years ago, they had a group of people in Zapata County that were there with brand spanking new camping equipment. They knew they were from the Middle East. They were there 3 or 4 days, and they left. All of that's perfectly okay, but who were they? When did they come in? What were they doing? And how long they were going to stay? We have a right to know that. And every industrialized country does. But there is no excuse in the world for us to have the most porous borders in the Western Hemisphere.
Well, that's another discussion that's going to happen, that's going to be data-based, right? There seemed to be some discomfort in recent hearings about just how we're measuring how well what we're getting in terms of border security for the spending we're doing now, right?
Yeah, we know how many people we're catching. We know how many tons of contraband we're seizing. What we don't know and can only estimate is what's getting by us. And so what the DPS is trying to do, if they can do this much with $800 million, can they do this much with $1 billion? It's a very open-ended question. But the discussion itself is timely, and people want to see some action there.
Something we haven't talked about is, and you are from a part of the state where water is an issue, for example, is infrastructure, right? If a national infrastructure program does get underway, and again, the president-elect has talked about this. I think there's division in the National Republican Caucus, but it's something the National Democrats are looking at possibly as a realm of cooperation. Does Texas go along with that? Is that good for us? You know, can Texas take infrastructure money from the federal government?
We certainly have in the past. I forget what it was called. It was something Trans 21 or something like that at the turn of the century. Isn't it interesting that we're talking about the turn of a century? And it put billions of dollars all over the United States. And they were for highways and bridges that we were going to have to repair anyway. And it's nice having that money. I mean, that's what people are sending all this money to the federal government. They ought to get some return for it. And so, yeah, we can use that infrastructure money. All that sort of thing is very expensive. Clearly, based upon what TxDOT projects, we can't really come up with all of it located just in the state. So that federal infrastructure policy, I think, is very important.
Somebody came to you and said, what do we really need infrastructure-wise in Texas? What would you emphasize?
Well, farm to market roads and state highways in West Texas. Not that I'm parochial. Well, what people will tell you that half of the people in the state of Texas live along I-35, and TxDOT is going to designate some money for what they call congestion, which means I-35. But all that money's got to come from somewhere, and it comes from projects that really need to be done in other parts of the state. Doesn't matter whether you live in Dallas County or Dallam County. Your need for transportation is exactly the same. In 1959, the Department of Transportation announced that one of their priorities was going to be a loop around Amarillo. Lubbock's got one, Houston's got two, things like that. So here's 1959. Now in 2016, it's maybe not halfway done. And so now it's on roughly the same schedule as the Great Wall of China, which was done with manual labor. That's kind of embarrassing.
Yeah. How do you feel about trains in Texas?
Well, I like trains, okay? I haven't been in the steel business. We got in, I don't know, a third of our inventory by rail. It's an absolutely essential part of transportation in the state of Texas and the United States.
For passengers?
Has been a startling lack of success in economic viability. There are a couple of routes on Amtrak that cash flow, and everything else hemorrhages red ink.
So that sounds skeptical to me.
Thank you. I've been told it's cynical, and my mother always told me that was unattractive. And so cynical, thank you.
Well, you wear it pretty well.
Thank you. And in truth, we sit around West Texas and talk about a bullet train between Dallas and Houston, and we go, big deal. Our transportation industry is built around the automobile and the airlines in the state of Texas. Europe's grew up around the train, and that's why it works so beautifully. Mass transit works if you have the mass, like Japan. They're going to have a tough time in Texas, and it's not going to make money, I don't think.
I think with that, I'm going to thank you and open it up to questions from the audience. See if we have a tough crowd, maybe. Audience, anybody with a question? We've got somebody with a microphone, so please wait. Raise your hand.
They can't be stunned into silence because I have that effect on no one.
Thank you. Can you hear me, Senator?
Yes, I can.
Thanks for being here. I'm Lauren McGaughy with the Dallas Morning News. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
I have two totally unrelated questions. First, the local control issue that you were speaking about, does that extend to non-discrimination ordinances for LGBT Texans? And then second of all, we've seen the in-state tuition bill filed already. Representative Stickland in the House has filed to do away with that program. Now, I think it's its 15th year. So I wanted to see what you thought of that proposal. Is this the year where we might see those children lose the right to in-state tuition?
I don't know. There's a reason that bill hasn't been addressed before, or reasons. Do I think it will have any more traction? I don't know. Once again, I want to see what the legislation is and what it does, and want to make sure that everyone is treated equally, because it's one thing if you remove that tuition for someone who goes to Midwestern. Well, okay, they're out of college. At UT and Texas A&M, and things like that, because they have more resources, they can keep those students because they'll just give them scholarships in addition to what they get. And so the application of it will not have the same effect around the state, and I think that's important. When it comes to the LGBT thing, once again, I want to see what the bill really says, because it is local law enforcement that deals with the problems that are potentially caused. And so how then do local jurisdictions intend to deal with it? If there is a discussion of exempting private entities and just making governmental entities, well, then who are we really protecting? If the threat of criminal assault is the reason that we're doing it, I'm probably the first, if not one of the first men to head a sexual assault awareness organization in the United States. Sexual assault is nothing to be dismissed or taken lightly. But we want to make sure what the real risk and incidences is, particularly related to choice of wardrobe. And that's why we need to talk to law enforcement. We're going to have a lot of witnesses from law enforcement say, here's what our real risks are when it comes to sexual assault. We need to have that discussion. I think it's one worthwhile. It must be worthwhile because the president weighed in. I think it's less of a civil rights issue than it is to me in terms of local control.
Other question? Over there.
Hi, Senator. My name is Megan Moeller, and I'm a student in the government department. I have a question about campus carry.
Your dean is here, so make this good.
There have been proposals in both directions to tweak campus carry, and I was wondering if you see any prospect for change and if there are any changes that you would support. And I'm also curious about what you're looking at to evaluate the implementation of the law.
Well, the assertion that you heard last week by someone who said that state institutions are free to ignore it, that is not the case. It is still state law, like it or not. I'm really eager I think the institutions and the systems were painstakingly careful to look at the implementation and things like those exclusion zones and things like that. And I'm eagerly awaiting for them to tell us what the effects have been, and do they see additional risk areas. Chancellor McRaven was very clear that what maybe worried him most was a bunch of exultant students coming out of a basketball game, a football game. This is a good place to talk about exultant students. And in addition to the amount of alcohol that may be consumed, firing celebratory shots into the air, which is just dangerous as heck. And so needs to be very much a dialogue. I wouldn't be surprised to see institutions that have put in those exclusion zones to see some litigation if they have not already. I'm interested in to see what form that is and if it is really a Second Amendment issue. People wake up every morning with a tremendous amount of responsibility when they run these institutions, and they're responsible in no small part for the safety and security of those students. How they feel that this thing weighs in on the students is going to be interesting. I have seen or heard very, very few problems to this point that have come out of this. There's so few students actually really covered by the whole thing. And at this point, if there's some changes, I'd like to know what people want to change and how, and I think we ought to have that dialogue all the time.
Other questions?
Hi, my name is Nadine Gibson, and I'm also a government student. We just went through another low turnout election in Texas with a lot of concern about voter integrity, but there's little evidence of malfeasance. Given that the courts just threw out the Texas voter ID law, is it anything more than political to take up these issues again, and is it worth the cost to defend it?
We go back to 1952, and you cannot say that Texas elections are without manipulation and things like that. There was one member of this, former member of the Senate, whose grandfather was voting in Marshall, Texas 38 years after he died, which we don't even do that in the Panhandle. And so we have to address that. Low voter turnout happens everywhere. And the voter turnout, I think, in this election was better than a lot we've seen.
A little bit.
But let me tell you, in city elections in Austin, I can tell you who's going to win the election in 2020. Apathy. That's who wins most elections. I was talking to a group recently and thought I was going to get, I thought I was going to get assaulted when I said, we have exactly the government we deserve. And they said, no, we deserve much better. No, you don't. Based upon who we elect or who we don't elect, and if we stay home, we got what we deserve.
Do you think, I want to follow up on that, do you think given the tough time that voter ID law has had in the courts that it'll be back on the agenda, the legislature this time?
Sure, I think it will be, and it has to be constitutional. It cannot be discriminatory. We took elements like the potential cost. I think if the state's going to require people to have a photo ID and it costs money, you shouldn't be able to not vote because you didn't have the money. And we have to be very, very careful how it's done, clearly. But yeah, I think it'll be back.
I think we have time for one more.
One more government student, and who apparently been informed of some credit treatment here.
Hi, Senator Seliger. My name is Caleb Kane, and I'm also a government student here at the University of Texas. But I wanted to ask you, you may have heard a little bit about this Iowa legislator who wants to budgetarily penalize campuses that provide post-election support to students. And I wondered if you had any reaction or thoughts about that.
Post-election support to students?
Yeah, some like emotional support for students post-election.
In other words, special, extra emphasis on.
I think that I'm going to speak for President Fenves now because his week's been going way too easy. So I'm going to speak for President Fenves now, and this is a good place to talk about because you all have very comprehensive health services provided, including psychological and I assume psychiatric. And I think the university intends to do that. And what affects the need for that? I don't know that this university or any university is necessarily going to discriminate. So is it post-election? Is it going to be post-final exam? Is it going to be post-last boyfriend or girlfriend? I don't know that universities are going to discriminate that way. And so I feel no anxiety toward that. I think the university will decide where its resources should be spent when it comes to the needs and welfare of the students. Come on, let's take one more.
Okay. One more.
Surely there's another student in government who, if I can get you a little credit, will you speak up and we'll lobby the dean?
They're doing this all because they want to.
Oh, well, that's good too.
Anybody else?
Okay.
Okay, then I think with that, you've exhausted them. So with that, thank you again for taking the time to be here with us. Much appreciated. Thanks to our in-studio audience, to our live stream audience. We'll have links to a video of this conversation at the Texas Politics Project website. That's texaspolitics.utexas.edu, along with links to all of our other work, including polling data, our blog, our online web text, and teaching resources. That's the plug. Thanks again, and so long, and thanks for watching. And thanks again to Senator Seliger.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
That's great.